Across all of Earth's deep past, few ideas feel as strange and as hard to imagine as a world without ice. Today, glaciers crown mountains, ice sheets blanket Antarctica and Greenland, and frozen water quietly shapes oceans, climates, and ecosystems. It's so familiar that we tend to assume it's permanent. Ice feels like a built-in feature of Earth itself, something that has always been here and always will be. But that assumption couldn't be more wrong, because for vast stretches of time, Earth had no permanent ice at all. Not at the poles, not on mountains, not anywhere. No glaciers carving valleys, no polar caps reflecting sunlight, no frozen reservoirs locking away fresh water. Instead, the planet was warmer, wetter, and in many ways, far more alien than anything we know today. And if you want to find the last time Earth looked like that, you have to go back tens of millions of years, long before humans, before apes, even before many of the animals we recognize today existed. Back to a time when the poles were green. The last fully ice-free chapter of Earth's history occurred during the late Eocene epoch, roughly 40 to 34 million years ago. This wasn't just a slightly warmer version of modern Earth. It was a fundamentally different planet. Temperatures were higher across the globe, on average about 5 to 8 degrees Celsius warmer than today. That might not sound like much, but on a planetary scale, it's enormous. It meant no freezing poles, no permanent snow, no vast ice sheets to regulate climate. Instead, Antarctica, now the coldest place on Earth, was covered in forests. Yes, forests. Fossil evidence shows that this frozen continent once supported lush vegetation, including ferns, mosses, and even trees. Rivers flowed freely, and animals roamed landscapes that today are buried under kilometers of ice. And Antarctica wasn't alone. Near the Arctic Circle, temperatures were mild enough to support dense plant life. Palm-like vegetation grew in regions that today experience months of darkness and extreme cold. This wasn't a world of extremes between hot and cold. It was a world of consistent warmth. But that warmth came at a cost. Without ice to lock away water, sea levels were dramatically higher, up to 70 meters above what we see today. Entire continents looked different. Coastlines were pushed inland, shallow seas flooded low-lying regions, and many of the places we now live simply didn't exist. If you could stand in what is now the southeastern United States, you wouldn't be looking at land. You'd be staring out over a warm, shallow sea. Large parts of Europe were fragmented into islands. Africa's coastline stretched far beyond its modern borders, and Asia's geography was constantly shifting under rising waters. Earth, in this era, was a water world compared to today. And that extra water didn't just reshape continents, it also supercharged the atmosphere. Warmer temperatures meant more evaporation. More evaporation meant more moisture in the air. And more moisture meant more extreme weather. Storms were likely stronger and more frequent. Rainfall patterns were unpredictable. Some regions experienced intense flooding, while others endured prolonged droughts. Wildfires may have been more common in drier areas, fueled by heat and seasonal dryness. This wasn't a calm paradise. It was a dynamic, sometimes chaotic environment. Yet life thrived. In fact, the absence of ice opened up ecological possibilities that simply don't exist today. Warm climates extended across much of the planet, allowing species to spread into regions that are now uninhabitable for them. Plants grew in abundance, forming dense forests that stretched across continents. And where plants thrive, animals follow. The late Eocene was a time of rapid evolution, especially for mammals. Just tens of millions of years after the extinction of the dinosaurs, mammals were diversifying into new forms, testing out body sizes, diets, and lifestyles. Some grew large and powerful. Others remained small and agile. but none of them had ever experienced a world with ice. Because ice, for them, simply didn't exist. And that meant evolution followed very different rules. There was no need for thick fur to survive freezing temperatures, no migration to escape winter, no seasonal cycles driven by snow and ice. Instead, life adapted to warmth, humidity, and abundance. It was a greenhouse world, stable in some ways, unpredictable in others, but entirely free of frozen extremes. And perhaps the most fascinating part of all is that this ice-free Earth wasn't some ancient anomaly from the planet's distant beginnings. It existed relatively recently, at least in geological terms, close enough that its ecosystems, its creatures, and its climate still echo in the world we live in today. But to truly understand just how different this planet was, you have to dive beneath the surface, into the oceans. If the land of the late Eocene was warm and strange, the oceans were something else entirely. They were vast, warm, and teeming with life, stretching across a planet where coastlines were blurred and shallow seas covered enormous areas. And in those waters lived some of the most formidable predators Earth has ever seen. Because without ice, the oceans weren't just bigger, they were richer. Warmer temperatures allowed marine ecosystems to expand, creating ideal conditions for large, active hunters. Among the most dominant were ancient whales known as basilosaurids. These early whales were nothing like the gentle giants we know today. They were predators. Fast, agile, and equipped with long bodies and powerful jaws, they hunted with precision and aggression. Some species reached lengths of up to 18 meters, with serpentine bodies that made them look more like sea snakes than mammals. In fact, when their fossils were first discovered, scientists didn't even realize they were whales. They thought they were marine reptiles. That's how alien they appeared. One of the most infamous among them was Basilosaurus, a top predator of its time. It had a long, flexible body, sharp teeth designed for tearing flesh, and the speed to chase down prey in open water. And it wasn't picky. Fish, sharks, smaller whales, even members of its own species were all on the menu. This was a creature that ruled the seas through sheer dominance. But Basilosaurus wasn't alone. Sharing these waters were massive sharks, early relatives of the giants that would come later. Some species grew over 9 meters long, filling ecological roles similar to modern apex predators. They patrolled the oceans alongside predatory whales, creating a marine ecosystem defined by competition and danger. And then there were the sea snakes. Not the relatively small, venomous species we see today, but enormous, elongated hunters that could exceed 10 meters in length. These creatures likely used ambush tactics, hiding in murky waters before striking with powerful jaws. With flexible bodies and stealth on their side, they added yet another layer of threat to an already dangerous ocean. In this world, the water was not a refuge. It was a battlefield. And yet, it was also a place of incredible diversity. Coral reefs flourished in the warm, shallow seas, supporting complex ecosystems filled with fish, invertebrates, and smaller predators. Plankton thrived, forming the base of a food chain that supported everything from tiny organisms to massive hunters. The oceans were alive in a way that's difficult to fully grasp today. But life wasn't confined to the water. On land, evolution was just as active and just as strange. Forests dominated much of the planet, creating dense, humid environments filled with life. These weren't the temperate forests we know today. They were thick, tropical ecosystems stretching far beyond the equator into regions that are now cool or even frozen. And within them, mammals were evolving rapidly. Some resembled early versions of animals we recognize: primitive horses, early rhino-like herbivores, and distant relatives of elephants. Others were completely unfamiliar. Strange combinations of traits appeared as evolution experimented with new forms. Body sizes varied dramatically, from small tree-dwelling creatures to massive herbivores weighing several tons. And with abundant plant life, there was no shortage of food. But where there is prey, there are always predators. And in this world, predators came in many forms. Mammalian carnivores were emerging, developing sharper teeth and stronger bodies for hunting. But they weren't the only ones at the top. Reptiles still held significant power, especially in warmer regions. Some crocodile-like animals adapted to life on land, becoming fast-moving hunters capable of chasing down prey. Unlike modern crocodiles, these creatures didn't rely solely on water. They could pursue animals across open terrain. And then there were the birds. Not the small, delicate birds we often imagine, but giant, flightless predators. In certain regions, these birds dominated the food chain, using speed and powerful beaks to hunt other animals. They filled roles similar to large mammalian predators, competing for dominance in a rapidly evolving ecosystem. For a time, the balance of power between mammals, reptiles, and birds was surprisingly even. No single group had complete control. It was a world in transition, a planet experimenting with life in the absence of ice. But this balance wouldn't last, because far to the south, something was changing, a shift that would transform the entire planet. For millions of years, Earth remained warm, ice-free, and full of life adapted to those conditions. But beneath the surface of this stability, slow changes were unfolding. Not sudden catastrophes, not dramatic impacts, but gradual shifts, driven by the movement of continents themselves. One of the most important changes was happening in Antarctica. During the late Eocene, Antarctica wasn't yet the isolated frozen continent we know today. It was still connected, or at least partially linked, to other landmasses. And that connection allowed warm ocean currents to reach its shores, keeping the climate relatively mild. But over time, tectonic forces pulled Antarctica farther south and separated it from neighboring continents. This separation had a profound effect. It allowed a powerful ocean current to form, one that would circle the continent uninterrupted. This current effectively cut Antarctica off from warmer waters, and without that heat, temperatures began to drop. At first, the changes were subtle. Winters grew colder. Snow began to accumulate in certain regions. But unlike before, that snow didn't fully melt. Year after year, it built up, layer upon layer, until something remarkable happened. Ice began to form. Permanent ice. For the first time in millions of years, Earth was no longer ice-free. This moment, around 34 million years ago, marks one of the most significant turning points in Earth's climate history, the beginning of large-scale glaciation. And once it started, it didn't stop. Ice sheets expanded across Antarctica, reflecting sunlight back into space and accelerating the cooling process. Global temperatures dropped. Weather patterns shifted, and ecosystems around the world began to change. Forests that once thrived in cooler regions started to shrink. Grasslands began to spread, opening up new environments for grazing animals. Species that couldn't adapt to the cooling climate faced extinction. Others evolved new traits, thicker fur, better insulation, and behaviors suited to seasonal changes. Migration became more important. So did hibernation. Life was no longer adapting to constant warmth. It was adapting to change. And this shift didn't just affect land. The oceans changed too. Cooling temperatures altered currents, nutrient flows, and marine ecosystems. Some of the dominant predators of the warm Eocene seas began to disappear. Others evolved into new forms better suited to cooler waters. Over millions of years, the world we recognize today began to take shape. Ice became a permanent feature of the planet. First in Antarctica, then, much later, in the northern hemisphere. And eventually, Earth entered the long ice age we're still living in today. But here's the fascinating part. Even now, in the modern world, we're technically still in an ice age. Because as long as permanent ice exists at the poles, the definition still applies. We're simply in a warmer phase, an interglacial period, a temporary break in a much longer cycle of cold, which raises an interesting question. Could Earth ever return to a completely ice-free state? The answer is yes, but not anytime soon. Without major changes, Antarctica is likely to remain near the South Pole for tens of millions of years. And as long as it stays there, conditions will favor the persistence of ice. Eventually, tectonic movement could shift continents again. Ocean currents could change, and the balance that allows ice to exist could be disrupted. If that happens, Earth could once again become a greenhouse world, a planet without ice, with higher seas, warmer climates, and ecosystems unlike anything we know. But that future is incredibly distant. For now, we remain in a world shaped by ice. A world where frozen water quietly controls sea levels, weather patterns, and the distribution of life. And yet, hidden in the rocks beneath our feet is the memory of a very different Earth, a warmer Earth, a wilder Earth, an Earth without ice.